Boundaries are huge for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. I think a lot of us have unresolved childhood trauma that we don't even realize is kind of sticking around and influencing our lives. And when I started to journal, I realized I needed to start asking myself really tough questions. And I journal a few pages, and I realized how much it was helping me. They weren't fleeting thoughts anymore. They were more goals for me to work on.
Today's guest is my dear friend, Kim Nguyen, host of the personal growth podcast, Time to Grind. She is a poet and a personal development coach with an emphasis on journaling your way to your best self. As someone who lives with anxiety and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, Kim is an ongoing advocate for mental health awareness and currently resides in Las Vegas with her 2 children. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much for having me, Anita.
What is one of the most courageous things you have done? I'm sure there's many.
Oh, wow. There is many. I would have to say the most courageous thing I've done was decide to start healing, to start taking an active role in my own healing. I think for a lot of years, I used feeling broken as an excuse to continue with a lot of poor behaviors that weren't serving me well and contributing to me staying in a place in my life that just left me feeling really broken. And I used my PTSD, my anxiety, as a means to keep myself in a place that was just very broken. I was overeating. I had binge eating disorder. I was at my heaviest and at my lowest for sure. I couldn't let people in. And I almost used it as I wore it all like as a badge of honor. I kind of saw myself as this strong person who wouldn't let anyone in and could manage on my own. And in reality, I didn't realize I wasn't doing a very good job of that. So deciding to start healing and start doing the inner work on myself was probably the most courageous thing I decided to do.
Fantastic to actually make that move. You just said there, inside work. Key point. Everybody always thinks it's outside of them. I love it. Thank you. So for anybody that's listening that doesn't know what PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder is, do you want to just explain that a little bit more, please?
We all go through traumatic things in our lives. And I think a lot of people think that PTSD is a result of physical trauma, and emotional trauma can be just as debilitating. Our mind and our body actually don't differentiate between physical trauma and emotional trauma. We process it exactly the same. And trauma can be, I think a lot of us have unresolved childhood trauma that we don't even realize is kind of sticking around and influencing our lives. I read a book during my own healing journey called The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, wow.
Which I highly recommend to anyone who has trauma or is close with anyone, has a loved one who suffers from PTSD. It gives you a really good insight into what trauma responses are and how our body and our mind kind of react to triggers, things that can set us off regarding our trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder has a lot to do with the way your body and your mind react to things that can trigger a traumatic event in your life that happened. For myself, I had physical trauma from my very early 20s. I was sexually assaulted by someone I knew. About 3 years ago, I went through some emotional trauma. And I honestly have to say, the emotional trauma was much harder to deal with than the physical trauma. I wouldn't even say I have a lot of PTSD revolving around my physical trauma. A little bit, sort of, when it comes to trusting men, I think. But Mostly it's all the emotional trauma. I had someone in my life who I was romantically involved with that I trusted to be who they said they were, and that turned out to be not true. There's a lot to unpack around that. That would be like an entire episode. But, ultimately that led me to have a lot of trust issues with a lot of a lot of things that felt very abnormal to me, and in turn caused me to punish myself internally for these things. I would meet any new person in my life, regardless if it was in a romantic situation or not, and wonder if they were who they said they were. Was that the job that they actually worked? Are they actually married? Are these actually their children? Like, is their life what they say it is? And that's a very hard response to have to trauma. I couldn't let new people in for a very long time. So everyone's trauma is different. There's like 20 or so indicators that can indicate sort of what kind of trauma responses you have and how you've been affected by it. But ultimately, like, trauma comes down to the way we respond to things that happen to us. And they can be very simple things. A lot of people who have physical trauma have trouble with people coming up behind them.
Yes.
And not knowing who's behind them. I tend to be very aware of my personal space. I don't like people to get in it without like my consent and things like that. So that's basically like the gist of PTSD. It's managing and living with those responses and how they affect our lives.
Yeah, because that is another thing, how living with it affects your life. So yeah, that's absolutely a clear indication.
It's not just living with it too. It's how it affects the people around us, because it absolutely does. I think a lot of people with PTSD and people who have loved ones with PTSD probably don't realize this. Boundaries are huge for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think a lot of people think boundaries are about other people's behavior. And they're really about our own. They're about the person who's setting the boundary. They're about the people with the trauma. It's not about anyone else's behavior. It's about how I respond to that behavior. So when I set a boundary, let's just use like an easy boundary that anyone might set in a relationship, right? So someone might say, if they want a monogamous relationship and they've been cheated on before, someone might say, you can't cheat on me, right? And kind of set the boundary that way. Like, I won't tolerate it. And that becomes about their partner's behavior, right? You can't cheat on me. A proper boundary would sound like, I don't exist in relationships where there's infidelity.
Wow.
So that puts the responsibility for the behavior on me. I can't control what my partner does. So if they decide to be unfaithful to me, then I've set the boundary that I will no longer exist in that relationship. It's about that, I think. And a lot of people get caught up in, when they're not educated on their trauma responses and boundaries, they get caught up in the idea that other people need to manage their triggers and I think it's important for people who love us to be aware of things that trigger us, especially a romantic partner, but it's not their responsibility. It's for sure ours.
Absolutely love that response. And like you said, generally speaking, people might set it in a way you can't do, etc., etc. But actually it's about flipping it around, and I won't tolerate, or I won't be in here no longer. And that's beautifully put.
Right. It's a simple phrasing. Like, I can't stay in a conversation where I'm being verbally attacked, or I can't exist in XYZ situation and feel safe. So I will remove myself from it.
Yeah.
It takes the responsibility off of the other person and puts it on myself, and it makes me feel more in charge. It makes me feel more capable and responsible. And then I'm not constantly worried about micromanaging what's happening around me.
Absolutely. Yes. So tell me
Yeah.
more about your personal development coaching with the emphasis of journaling. I love the sound of that.
So I've been journaling my whole life.
Mm.
As long as I can remember writing, I've had diaries and journals, and I've loved notebooks. And about a year and a half ago, I was really in the worst place of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I had stopped journaling or anything like that because had a marriage fall apart some years back.
Mm-hmm.
And right after that, I had a relationship where my partner at the time read a lot of my journals.
Ooh.
And so I felt like I couldn't write anymore because I felt such a violation that my private thoughts and my emotions that were really just between me and that piece of paper
Mm-hmm.
were now, someone else had access to that information, and I felt so violated by it. So I didn't write in journals for a long time. And in September of 2020, I was really at the worst place in my life. I was at my heaviest physically, emotionally, and mentally very broken. I was debilitated with PTSD and anxiety. And I discovered a mental toughness program that I jumped into, and it completely transformed my life. Rather, I completely transformed my life. It gave me the tools to do so. But very early on, I think I was a couple weeks in, I could feel changes starting to happen in myself. And I decided to start journaling my way through it.
Oh, wow.
Something I hadn't done in a very long time. And I was single at the time. It was a big reason I decided to start changing my life. And I stopped dating because I had tried, and I realized I really couldn't let anyone in, and that wasn't fair to the people I was trying to date.
Yes.
So I decided to stop dating and start to try and just focus on myself. And I found this program. And when I started to journal, I realized I needed to start asking myself really tough questions. And I think I'd been doing that for a while. But the problem is we often ask ourselves tough questions and
Mm-hmm.
answer them or come up with ideas and solutions. And then what happens 3 hours later? Or an hour later, or even 10 minutes later, the idea's gone, and we don't often go back to it or think about it again. And I found that when I wrote things down,
Mm-hmm.
it was different. It stuck with me. I'd think about it more. I'd process it during the week. So every week I started diving into something that I knew I was having a problem with. I'd ask myself some really hard questions about it, and I'd journal a few pages. And I realized how much it was helping me to
Excellent.
just ask myself these really hard questions, because they weren't fleeting thoughts anymore. They were more goals for me to work on. I heard, and I don't know who said it at all, but I heard once that a dream is just a dream until you write it down on a piece of paper and it becomes a goal.
Yes.
And so I found that when I started talking to myself on paper about the things I needed to work on, I actually started to find solutions and work on it and get better at it, because they became goals now. I wrote them down. They were somewhere.
That's excellent. We all know about setting goals. We all work through, but actually to realize that and write them down and work on them. And the actual key point there is, the nugget of wisdom is writing them down, and you actually realize, writing them down is better than just having a thought, fleeting thoughts that come and go, but writing them, seeing your thoughts on paper, I think is a very powerful thing.
Well, it's like that with anything, right? What do we do when we go to the grocery store if we forget our list? Like, how often do we forget something? And then if we look at the ways we need to work on ourselves, so often we think about it and we don't do it.
Yeah.
So when we write it down, it just kind of becomes a thing now. Like, this is something I've written down, and there's something very different about putting pen to paper and, asking yourself really hard questions really looking at why you are the way you are and why you do the things you do. And not just about yourself, but I do this with the people around me. How are the people around me influencing? Because our environment, our circle, the people we surround ourselves with, whether that's in person or on social media, matters. Like those things
Yes.
filter their way into our brain, our life. And, you know, when we pay attention to those things too, not just ourselves, you get a lot of insight into your environment. Because if you have a garden, if you have a flower, a plant, and it's not blooming, are you blaming the flower, the plant for not growing? Or do you look at the soil and the sunlight and how often you're watering it? Like, what's the environment like for that plant, right?
Simply put, but powerful. Yes.
Yeah.
So what took you on your journey to get started on your personal growth podcast called Time to Grind?
So funny. I never really listened to podcasts before I started my own journey with personal growth. I did a little bit. I was a big true crime podcast person.
Wow.
But besides that, I never really dug into a lot of personal development. I kind of thought it was like cheesy, and the idea of things like meditation and yoga sounded silly to me. And I didn't really know how powerful they were. And as you know, I started this personal growth program that I did when I started this mental toughness program. I had a 45-minute outdoor workout every day. And so on my workout, I started listening to various podcasts. Found I really loved them. I fell in love with like Tim Ferriss and Trent Shelton and all these wonderful people that had such great ideas, and it made me want to grow more. And as I shared my own journey through social media, I found I had a lot of engagement. I'm one of those people who's always felt like I was meant for more. I think a lot of people feel like this about themselves. They're living kind of the existence that society tells them they should live. Get a safe job, start a family, do all of these things that you're supposed to do, and then you'll be happy, right? Only I did all of those things. I had a job, I started a family, and then my marriage fell apart and life kind of turned upside down, and I kind of had to like rediscover what made me happy. And I think a lot of us go back to what made us happy when we were kids, before the world kind of gets a hold of you and tells you who you're supposed to be. And for me, it was always creativity. It was always writing. And I always felt like I had these big, juicy ideas for life. And they kind of always just sat with me. And I never did anything with them. And a podcast was never on my radar. And then the more I started listening to them, and I was sharing a lot of ideas that I had for personal growth and my own personal growth on social media, and I found out it was so helpful to people. I was hearing people say I was inspiring, and they loved my ideas, and they related to everything I said. I share the darkest parts of myself, the broken parts of myself, because I don't think people relate to the people that are at the top. I think they relate to the people who are struggling. I was more than happy to share my struggle, because it not only was helping people, but it made me feel less alone. And so I thought, why can't I bring that to more people? So I thought podcast is great because I'm pretty introverted. So I can, you know, sit in my room and talk and that'll be fine. So I kind of just jumped in really on a whim. I knew if I overthought it too much, I'd probably talk myself out of it. Fear would probably set in, and like imposter syndrome, and I'd self-sabotage, and looked up how to start a podcast and went for it. And it's been really amazing. You know, it's fantastic. It's a journey of its own for sure, but that's kind of how it started. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, I love it. It's absolutely fantastic. You know, when you realize actually you just by, like you said, they don't want influencers. They want real people, real situations, life as it is for all of us.
I think what's been great for the people, especially the people who started listening when I started it,
Mm-hmm.
is that they kind of went through my journey with me real time.
Okay.
You know, they saw me and they continue to see me working on myself.
Mm.
I'm not some person at the top. And there's great. Like I listen to people further along than I am
Mm-hmm,
too,
mm-hmm,
because
mm-hmm.
that's who we learn from, right?
Yes.
We never want to be
Mm.
the smartest person in the room, or we're in the wrong room.
Absolutely. Love that.
And so, you know, I thought, okay, like I've done really well. I can for sure help someone. And so I think that everyone needs some to hear from someone who's been where they've been and is doing what they want to
Mm-hmm.
do.
Yeah. It's the rawness of it all that they can
Yeah.
relate to. Some people pick up ideas, they'll think, okay, even if it's one little nugget, one little thought they've had, they can implement it into their life and change their own lives. And who doesn't want to like help? We all want to be a better world.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Absolutely. And like I think we're kind of a generation of people. I'm 42. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think, you know, my age, give or take like 10 years or so,
Mm-hmm.
is a generation of people who our parents that came before us have for sure trauma from their own parents, and we have it
Yes.
from our parents, and this
Mm-hmm.
continues to get
Mm-hmm.
passed down. And my hope is that as this happens, like my children will deal with less than I did, and you know, I'm dealing with less than my parents did.
Yeah,
And
for
but I
sure.
think we're really the first generation to take an active role
Mm-hmm.
in our healing,
Mm.
and really start to get better, because or we heal, you know, hurt people. And so
Yes.
we're hurting people less the more we heal, particularly ourselves. It's kind of nice to see a lot of people pay attention to their mental health, their emotional
Mm.
health. I know you mentioned earlier that so many people think it's the exterior, right? It's the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
physical results. And that is for sure a byproduct of like diet culture and social media.
Yes.
And a lot of those things come with working on yourself in general. You know, you want to be healthier and
Mm-hmm.
happier and live longer when you feel better,
Mm-hmm.
when you feel better internally. A lot of the times that translates to just feeling good about yourself
Mm-hmm.
externally, not even looking
Mm.
good. You know, courage and confidence go hand in hand and
Absolutely.
do a lot for your outer appearance. You're happier and more positive.
For sure. What words of wisdom would you give to anyone that's struggling right now that does want to heal their life? What can you recommend on a starting point? Any tips they could start on their journey of healing? Because we all know healing is so important for us.
So I think a lot of people don't realize how much they have to heal internally. And I
Mm.
think the second it starts to get hard, a lot of people quit and think that the physical transformation will bring them some type of happiness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that my advice um, is just to start
Mm.
somewhere. That's the hardest part,
Yes.
is to start, because it's much easier to live in a broken place and feel like you have all of these excuses
Mm-hmm.
about why you are the way you are, instead of taking an active role in your healing. And you know, I say all the time, I wish people could see the other side of it. Like I wish they can
Yes.
just, you know, I'll see people post on social media about these toxic relationships they're in, or
Ooh.
you know, their poor mental health. And I think for me, the answer is self-love.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing in your life
Mm-hmm.
will improve the way you want it to until you start loving yourself, learning to really love yourself. Because when you start to love yourself, you will not settle for the things that you have been settling for: bad relationships, unhealthy habits. You will do things that start to serve yourself and your life much better. And I'm in a healthy relationship now, but
Fantastic.
thank you. That's because I really learned to love myself. I got to a point where I said, if it's just me, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I'm okay
Yeah.
because I love myself. I love my company.
Mm.
A life alone is okay. I'm happy with my life. And I don't think a lot of people can say that about themselves and their own life. And I think people almost need to get to that place where they can sustain a life and be happy on their own. And that's not to say we don't need people, right? We're humans, we need friends
Yes.
and love and connection and things like that, but I'm not dependent on another person to fulfill my own self-love. I can fill that cup for myself. And I think that's the key, really, because it sustains, it sustains our growth and our healthy habits, and that's not just, eating and exercising and things like that. That's emotionally, mentally healthy things, the way we communicate, the way we have a relationship with work and our families and things like that. So it's all really self-love for me.
Couldn't have put it better myself. Absolutely perfectly put. And it is. And I think, like you just mentioned, the fact is people do depend. Happiness comes on the outside. It doesn't. You've got to be happy with yourself. And if you can be happy with yourself, your life will be so much better. Because you're already filled, like you said. Self-love is so important. Self-care, self-love. You've got to start with yourself and branch out.
Well, it's kind of like, do you ever hear people say or get mad that someone doesn't love them? Or, let's say a relationship ends and they're upset because the person they left them, they didn't love them. And my brain can always see now when that person doesn't love themselves. And I almost want to say, I know it sounds really harsh, but how can you expect someone to love you when you're not loving you?
Yes.
How can you get mad at someone for doing what you're not doing? Because when you truly love yourself, if I love my boyfriend dearly, but if he walked away from me, that's his loss. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
I'm worth loving and treating well and all of these things. And so is he. So I think it's more about realizing your worth and not settling. And that all happens when we truly, truly love who we are, and we can teach the people around us to love us the way that we love ourselves too.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So, Kim, where can the listeners find you online? What's your website and your podcast?
You can find my podcast on just about any platform you can listen on, Time to Grind Podcast. I also have a Facebook group for it if anyone is interested in personal growth. We talk about a lot of things there, and it's a wonderful, uplifting community. And then my Instagram is Kimbo_Brook with an E on the end. And I also have one, you can find Time to Grind Podcast just under that handle on just about any social media platform. So that's where you can find me. Come join me and grow along with me. I've been so thankful for this conversation. I love talking about courage. I think so many people look for the confidence to do things, and that's a mistake in my opinion. Courage is really what brings you confidence. So
excellent. Yeah. And I'll put all your details in the show notes so anybody can click along and join with you.
Thank you so much.
Kim, thank you for sharing your courageous journey with us today. And by doing so, you would have helped so many just listening to your story. Thank you. Kim Nguyen.
Thank you.
What is your definition of courage?
Oh, I would say for myself, my definition of courage is showing up for me. It's not breaking promises to myself and being stronger than my excuses. And most time that relates to just the decision to try every day. And that to know even when I fail, I have lessons in all of those failures and that I can try again tomorrow.